Hi, this is me, and speaking to Ben L from whose blog is Mazirians Gardens. So Ben, hi, it's nice to see you. I don't think we've met before, either online or in real life. Could you kick us off by telling us a little bit about your blog and how that came to be?
Sure. Yeah, I came in to the kind of OSR scene. I had been reading a bunch of blogs around the time Gary Gygax died, but I was really just a lurker, more or less. And I started a blog kind of as blogs died, but it coincided with my return to actually playing Dungeons and Dragons. Um, and Yeah, I guess the blog has always existed for me mainly as a way of kind of developing setting, kind of world building, developing setting, snowflake creation.
Right.
It's always kind of had that character. And then as I started running a regular game, it's also kind of has a synergy, a certain kind of synergy with that.
Right. You wrote about that, I think, in your a very good post because I've been through most of your blog today, and I can do that because it's relatively small but high quality. And you wrote about it, I think, in a post called "Escapism and RPGs," and I think there are a range of kinds of posts on your blog. There's a lot of world building and a lot of things are in worlds. There's some general discussion of stuff like the OSR, and there's also these really fascinating posts that link together your history with role playing with certain ideas about what it is and what it could be. So I think you're at a blog post called Escapism and Our Hobby, and that's all like the story of your life, kind of, or at least is it related to role playing? Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, the impetus for writing that post was uh, a kind of reaction against a kind of crude. I think we all know that role-playing games have an element of escapism to them. I mean, there's some truth to that, obviously,
Yeah.
in having these imaginary worlds together. They're not our world. That's part of the point of it. That's part of it's a kind of shared place that we go, and so it's very natural to kind of use this language of escapism. And so yeah, I was, but on the other hand, it's so reductive.
Right.
It seems such an impoverished way of understanding what it is to like inhabit these worlds together and engage in this like incredibly sophisticated, the most sophisticated game that was ever created by human beings. That's how I think about role-playing
Really?
games. And it's basically, yeah, I mean, there's an argument chess, but I mean, yeah, I think in a way, and yeah, and so I just was thinking like, what in the neighborhood of escape, what role did it play at various points in my life that were like that. And so I tried to try and de-simplify it, complexify the idea. Yeah.
I think you were right. That's an idea that I've had many times that like the definition of escapism and its application to a lot of genre things, but specifically to D&D is very limited. And I think what had a big effect on a lot of people who read that post was the way that your relationship with RPGs repeated at different points in their life, sometimes at points of deep stress, often at points of like personal chaos or distress. And in almost every case, it either was helped you maintain your sense of self or keep your life together. In many cases, it seems to have like helped you improve your life. I wouldn't say it necessarily in a kind of like Oprah-esque, this will improve your life sense, but it seemed to be a place for you to go to restore your sense of who you are and form links with other people that turned out to be very, very important in your development of your of yourself. I hope that's not too personal a reading.
No, it's not too personal, and it's true. I mean, I think one thing I had to get over, which I think people who are grown-ups and do D&D, especially if they grew up in the 80s and so on, have to get over at a certain point, is um, some idea that it's that because it's a game, and because it's a game that children can play, and it's because it's a game we played, or at least I'll speak for myself, that I played as a child. One can have a sense that it's a childish affair. that it's like a thing of child, you know, that's a child, it's not appropriate for adults to be doing. And, you know, before kind of I got into the kind of OSR blogosphere and the kind of renaissance of this kind of old styles of games, I think that's really what I thought. I mean, I didn't see like a kind of way you could inhabit it as a grown-up, but once I got over that, once I you know, was able to see that that was totally ridiculous, then, you know, then I think I was able to look back and see, you know, what you know, the kind of roles that it played in different parts of my life. I mean, when I returned to it as an adult, it was like quite directly an escape. I mean, I was literally in my mother's, this apartment, actually my aunt's house and apartment in New Jersey, and my mother was dying of cancer, and you know, and like reading these blogs was just like, I couldn't, my mind was wrecked for philosophy. I couldn't read philosophy, which is my day job. But I, so, you know, I kind of discovered the OSR in a way as a kind of escape, but then, you know, it opened back up. Yeah. So anyway, I think, you know, the part of the point of that post is to think about in a more substantive way, what role-playing games can and do for us if we don't just think about them as like, you know, things of childhood, you know, children's play or something like that.
Yeah, I began reading a lot of blogs when I was at a moment of, well, not personal crisis, but I wasn't in a great state. I was unemployed and living in a poor situation. And I think a lot of things can begin as an escape, but some of them, like for instance, crack cocaine could be an escape, or competitive fist fighting could be an escape, but those things would stay escapes because they numb you. Well, the fist fighting would help out long term, maybe. But the thing of the D&D is it doesn't stay, like you don't just retreat and then leave, although I suppose maybe some people do. But it almost inevitably connects you with other people because you can't play without them. And it means expressing yourself to other people some way or another. So as much as it takes you away from the immediate trauma you might be suffering, there's a lot to almost help you reintegrate yourself through the exercise of your imagination.
Yeah. Go ahead. Oh, just one last thing about that. I mean, this is also one thing about, you know, kind of the world of the OSR that I found immensely moving. And I didn't really know anything like this beforehand. I wasn't really involved in any fandoms of any kind. You know, I'm not like involved in all these little communities. And, you know, the sense of like solidarity, community, shared experience, dialogue, help, sharing, and so on. It's very unlike things in my ordinary experience in life in a late capitalism. And it's one of the things that attracts me to the community that continues to exist around this is, yeah, I find it actually very rich.
Really? Okay. There is one post that I wanted to ask you about, a really fascinating one. It's the one, I think, the Dreamlands Night. It takes us through a whole range of your relationship with dreams. And it tells the story of one of the very first games that you ever played, I think, of D&D. And it seems like quite, I think the actual first game you played might have been a different one. But if you're doing the autobiography or the movie, if you're cutting to an opening scene, this would probably be the first scene because it's the most fascinating. Would you tell like the audience of like three guys about the game with Sebastian in the...
Yeah, in the 5th grade. Right. So I had gotten Menser's Red Box a couple of years before, but like a lot of people, nobody was playing it quite, and I couldn't, you know, kind of figure out how to do it. And so I had the idea of D&D, but I hadn't really played it yet. And then there was this kid who came into our class in the 5th grade. He was this child of this kind of scam, like sort of wandering scam artist mother, punk mother. And so in the 5th grade, you know, he was a kid who, like, I think he had a mohawk. He was, yeah, he was immensely creative. He was an artist. Anyway, and so he started up this game of this role-playing game. I don't know what to call it exactly. It was diceless. We played it, just like on the playground, or maybe a little bit in class if we could get away with it. And it was the craziest game I've ever been in by a lot, by an order of magnitude. It was my very first game. And he played it. We never played it together. He always played it. There were, I think, 3 players or 4 players. And he always played it just one-on-one with us. It was competitive. It was actually kind of like Amber Diceless, the way you were describing it a little bit. It was competitive. I mean, the setup was that the kind of Lord of the Dreams came to each of us individually and offered us what we wanted most if we could like prevail in this like contest against him in I guess the Dreamland, something like that, the dream. And so we were trying to best this kind of omnipotent figure as we moved into these kind of surreal tests. And, I mean, I'm sure it was all totally arbitrary. But nonetheless, I mean, it had this thing. I mean, one was the adversarial competitive quality. It was extremely challenging. It was totally wild. And I mean, I write in the post about, well, one concrete thing I remember about it, which was that, another player beat me at solving this kind of riddle type situation, and he was very pleased with himself, and he was granted a wish, and he wished for the sword to fight the king of the Dreamlands, this kind of Morpheus-like figure, and Morpheus just killed him. We watched them fight, and he died. And I remember, and the kid just like wept and wept, and we like tried to comfort him, but it was so awesome, like it was so badass, like it made it seem like, oh my god. So yeah, we had this like totally surreal thing, was like my first this totally surreal thing that actually had certain kinds of OSR like qualities to it. I mean, in the kind of adversarial test of skill kind of quality, but on the other hand, it was just totally like the fever dream of this maniac, 10-year-old maniac. So yeah, that was quite an introduction. I've never played a game like that since. I think it wound down when 5th grade was winding down.
Right, I don't think you could, because I don't think you could get that back, could you? If you'd been that young and not knowing anything about it. Do you ever wonder what happened to that kid and what he's doing now?
I do. I mean, he had a tough road to hoe. He had a tough road to hoe. I mean, he was on and off homeless. His mother's main way of getting by was to kind of weasel her way into living arrangements with different people. He actually lived with me for a little while. They both lived with us in our tiny little apartment for a little while. But I did connect with him, like about 3-4 years ago. He found me, I think, actually, maybe it was, because I have a little bit of a web presence through my job. And so I think he found me and sent me an email, and we talked like on Skype. And, he was like living kind of on the edge in Amsterdam, I think. But we didn't talk about role-playing games, actually. It was before I wrote the post. I mean, I think probably talking to him was part of what put this in my mind again. But we didn't talk about role-playing games. I just wanted, we just talked about our lives. So that's the last I heard from him, yeah. But I hadn't spoken to him since I was 12. Or 15, maybe.
Well, there we go. I think that's the thrilling revelation for the interview. I think you were mentioning your community earlier and the positive effect you think it's had for you, and the fact that maybe it's something you don't have in the rest of your life. I think I had that from 2011 to 2016, and I think I'm in a different stage now. I kind of have a slightly paranoid attitude towards community. I feel very much like the guy in the windmill at the edge of the village who's up to some weird shit, and when he hears about the community, it's going to be guys with torches coming for him. But I think that might be more to do with my psychological state than anything else. But yeah, so I have a question here from Steve Sigty. He wants to know, how does your study of philosophy influence the themes and situations that you put into games you run and/or gaming material you write? Does it have any effect?
Yeah, the main thing, the main thing to say is that I think primarily it serves as kind of the opposite or the other of what I do. I mean, I like the for one thing, like philosophy is it really isn't play. It's kind of the opposite of play. I mean, I guess many things are the opposite of play, but it like I don't know, trying to think things through back to the first principles, and being involved in these kind of often esoteric, kind of endeavors. I mean, it has its thrills and its pleasures, but it's really not a form of play. And also, the kind of stuff I'm into in D&D is really this kind of lush, imaginative stuff. I mean, it was really encountering that stuff in the blogosphere as it was then that gave me the idea that this was something that I could do or would want to do. I mean, it just seemed so great. And this, this kind of like, so I'm doing a game in the Dreamlands. What are dreams? They're like, it's instead of inference, we have association. There's this kind of fevered, surreal state, and so it's kind of like this other thing, and so that's one thing to say, but it does creep in here and there, especially when I'm writing about or thinking about, kind of the texts, like manuscripts in the game, or the theories of metaphysical theories of, mad wizards or disputants. So two things come to mind. One was there is this this kind of mad vivimantic text, which is going to version of it's going to appear in this module that the Submerged Spire of Sarpedon the Shaper, Gavin Norman's Necrotic Gnome Press is going to put out a real version of that, and it's in there. And for that, these kind of mad biological heresies, I don't think I could have like written that without. I mean, I draw out like kind of Aristotle's philosophy of metaphysics of life and things from my my dissertation director Michael Thompson's stuff. And so that it does occasionally, or like some of the stuff about the metaphysics of the dreamland, when I imagine like disputing parties about like what, how does it work, and how does one waking world ground the reality of another dream. I mean, so there is a certain kind of, when metaphysics kind of percolate into the game around the edges, then I can, then it gets a little play. But basically, it's the other.
Right. I think for me, the other opposite of D&D will always be working in a call center, even though in both cases, because I'm playing online, I'm making a telephone call and basically dealing with information. And in some cases, arguing with people or explaining why people can't do things. So if you're looking at it from an informational perspective, I would be doing the same thing. But yeah, that's my antiverse to play. That could lead us into what Kayani asked. She said, sorry if the question is silly. It isn't. But do you ever dream of your setting? That would be kind of a trip, right? Dreaming of a dream.
Yeah, no, no. The only time I think I've dreamed of Dungeons and Dragons in the last few years, so the only time I can remember, a few weeks ago, I had an anxiety dream about running Dungeons and Dragons for a group of people who had never played before, and they were all like hipsters, and we were out at like a New Year's Eve, and we were going to do this before like revelries began, before people, and so we were at dinner, and it was like the typical anxiety dream where like I can't find my notes.
Oh no.
I start half-assing it, but then I stop because it's so bad to look for the notes. And then actually it was an interesting anxiety dream because normally it just kind of breaks off, but this one actually went to the conclusion. And the conclusion was they were like, wow, that sucked. So sorry. So that was the only time I ever dreamed of Dungeons and Dragons, and it wasn't really about the Dreamlands.
Cool, a classic social awkwardness,
Yeah.
based with a time limit as well, and in a formal setting, like bingo. Hold on, let me see what we had next. I wanted to ask about your gaming. Like, I think in your blog you said you had a thing going. You're playing online, and you have a thing going where you're playing with your neighbors. For one of those bizarre flukes of chance, a bunch of people who like D&D ended up moving in near to each other, and you were doing, I think at least a few years ago, a thing where you swapped DMs every few months. Is that still going on?
No, it's not. That wound down. Yeah, when before I started my online game, I started playing with this group of people from my neighborhood, Hyde Park in Chicago, kind of people who grew up in the neighborhood, like a 40-something electrician who moved in next door to me, and like his neighborhood friends, and it was kind of a great segue for me. There were things that were really interesting about it. The main thing that were interesting about it was this thing we did of cycling through DMs. So there was this this kind of world that was created. It was the last world that I would have invented. It was like, it was like a conflict-free, like society of people who were in harmony with nature, and there was no money. And you basically took everything that I would think of as like the, natural motivators out. And so it was not a world I would have created, but we did this really interesting thing of switching off DMs. And it was interesting as an experiment for me. And it did make me reflect on, kind of different systems you could use to do it. The way we did it was suboptimal. The way we did it was, I think the structural problem with having switching DMs is that you want to have an open world. So you want to have a world where it's more fun if it's an open world and the players are kind of deciding what they want to do. But I think that's easier to do if, you want to run what you've developed and like have authority over. And so this question about how you divide up the authority becomes very relevant. And we never, in our play, we never solved that exactly. And so it ended up being kind of railroady, because it would kind of be like, the DM would be like, this is what we're doing. And that was the system. And, I only had so much authority in the group. And so in a way, our play styles didn't jive. But it was super interesting for me. I mean, it was a group of people I never would have played with, I think, otherwise. And it was a great kind of segue back into the hobby. But yeah, so we kind of each took ownership of a different kind of part of the world and sort of developed it. And yeah.
That sounds fascinating. I think you wrote a post where you came up with some theoretical ideas about how you could have done it differently if you were swapping DM seats for like the ways of layering authority, and like I think one of them was the canon, and there's a different version. Is that right?
Yeah, there's one where people just have control over different parts of the world. So if you're going to go mess with this, then that person's the dungeon master. But the other one was one where you just do it like a kind of it's almost like they're games like this, but like theater games or something, but where you just, somebody's a DM for 4 sessions, and then wherever they stop mid-sentence, whatever, the next person picks up, and the only thing that's set is what's actually happened. So I mean, I think that would be fun. It would be kind of like there's something experimental and gimmicky about it. And I think if you did that, you would forsake certain pleasures that exist in DMing of But I do think it would be a viable way to handle it. Yeah.
Yeah, you gain a lot and lose a lot with improvisation. You lose a lot of like deep level problem solving, I suppose, and some elements of like planning and building and all that stuff. And you gain a lot of very unexpected and very like not random, but very fluid, like unlikely linkages between things. So it's kind of the more improvisation. I think you would get a very different tone of game, but it will be fascinating to try. Um, you did like two posts basically, one about the city state of the Invincible Overlord and one about the city state of the World Emperor. Two, they're basically reviews. But when you went through them, you talked about how your city's effect on you because you grew up in the East Village in the 80s and in Pittsburgh in the 2000s. What was that like? Because it seems to have, you said it had a big effect on your perception of what a city was, and you had said, what was it? A deep fantasy of possessing a kind of carnal knowledge of the secrets of the city, a seemingly endless world of human creation that abounds in secrets and wonder.
Yeah, this was something I was kind of obsessed with in college and graduate school. Like, I think, you know, where to start on this? I mean, one thing to say about this to kind of start with is I think it kind of helps to get the flavor of this if you know something about Pittsburgh.
I mean, if I don't, which is why I ask, because to me, both of these places are very exotic and interesting, so I have no idea what either of these places would be like to live in.
Pittsburgh is the craziest place I've ever lived, and it's one of the craziest places I've ever been, although I don't think it would be immediately apparent to you if you were there what it was like. But the city is constructed as a complete labyrinth. It's impossible to give anyone directions to get from anywhere to anyone else. You can give directions to natives, but you can't give directions. It's like to explain to someone who's visiting, you know, how to do that. I mean, there are all these streets that meet where there are 5 intersections, sometimes 2 streets. There's a place where 2 streets with the same name meet. One of these 5-way things. I mean, and then it's relentlessly and madly hilly. And then it has all these rivers intersecting it. And so there are all these, you know, there was like a book recently that was like documenting all the stairs. Somebody had walked all the stairs, and now I have no memory of how many, you know, 145, you know, these sheer iron stairs that just go up these hillsides, and the houses are just on them. And I remember I was in college, in grad school rather, and there was this right next to the University of Chicago, this neighborhood called Oakland. And in Oakland, there's something called, there's a hollow there. I think it's Panther Hollow. And this hollow, you know, like I just didn't, for my first couple of years there, I never went into it. It was kind of, you know, you had to go down these, I didn't know how to get to it. But when I found the stairs and went down it, I found there was this crazy neighborhood down there. Okay, this tiny, crazy neighborhood down in this inaccessible hollow. And then this set of train tracks. And if you walked along the train tracks, trains used to come, but they no longer came. If you walked along the train tracks for like a mile, you would walk past one isolated house, okay? And then you would find yourself, I found myself in this other hollow with a different neighborhood. And this neighborhood had like, you know, a Russian Orthodox church in it. It was, you know, mostly abandoned. And then if you took stairs from there, you got to a neighborhood that it would have taken you a half an hour to drive from Oakland. So like the city was like that. It was like you could live right next to a hollow for years and not realize that there were like these communities. And so the whole place was like to know it really well is like an incredible achievement. And then it also has this incredible character of this history. I mean, there was all this money. It was the center of US capitalism. The steel mills were all there. All these labor struggles and all this beautiful housing stock and these kind of ethnic enclaves. And then when manufacturing left the US, it, you know, kind of, so there's all this falling down splendor there too. It just like lends itself. So this, I mean, you know, also when I returned, I would return when I was in college to the East Village. And the East Village, you know, when I grew up in it, was like, it was the East Village of David Bowie. You know, it was had recently been the East Village of Allen Ginsberg, but now it was the East Village of David Bowie. And you know, and then it was the East Village of like crack addiction and gangs and crime. And so I couldn't go into Alphabet City really very much when I was a kid, because when I was an adolescent, if you were a kid, you were subject to violence. If you were traveling in a band and you went in there, and I mean, I have a very high tolerance for, I'm not easily scared by urban environments, but it was kind of perilous for me as like a geeky, weird, you know, white kid to like walk into Alphabet City alone was not the greatest idea. And so, you know, when the neighborhood started gentrifying, which was a horror show, don't get me wrong, but it did, and when I got older, it did, you know, there was this incredible thing where I'm like, I'm gonna go to all the places in my neighborhood where I never went when I was a kid. So again, there was like this kind of world that was like right next to me, which I would bump up against, you know, and, you know, but I never went east of Avenue A. Other than Tompkins Square Park, I would go to Tompkins Square Park, but, you know, I never, you know, B, C, D, and all that. And so again, it was like, it felt like there were all these, you know, there was all this incredible, like, you know, life, and it was right there, but it was hidden in some way for me. And so, you know, I had this experience of cities as kind of full of these kind of, yeah, these kind of hidden riches and secrets, and yeah.
It is fascinating. I'm getting an echo from me. Okay. Am I still? Yes. Okay. Give me a second. I'll drop out.
Okay.
Okay. So it's not you. It's definitely me. I'll just keep talking and hopefully I'll be fine. So that reminds me a little bit of my relationship with Birkenhead, which is a much smaller, less charismatic place. But again, it's a place where there was money once, a lot of it, and then it went. Nothing seems to create this sense of kind of numinosity or potential adventure or tragedy or like this feeling of mystery than a place having been powerful once and not being so now. It's almost powerful now. It doesn't really work the same way. But if there were grand projects and people with great ideas and people with enough money to like splurge on giant buildings with like, there's a guy in Liverpool an architect who built the name of the company of the building into each building he built because he thought sign makers were horrible and he said they defaced his lines. So he would only do the building with like the name of the company in the building. And there are these buildings, beautiful Victorian buildings with like the names of ancient, well not ancient, but 100-year-old insurance companies, like done in tiles and swoops, and then banged over them as the name of like local news. Yeah, and there were like strange things like missing rail lines. There's like a Masonic hall down the road that you wouldn't know if you had never walked down the street. I was walking past like a service street behind like a massive shopping center, turned into this building that looked like nothing. And as a grill came up, I looked into like the hallway, and there were these Victorian Masonic like large plaques saying this hall erected 19 so on by the HRH so and so with like giant Masonic signs in it. And I only saw those because a grill was up, and I never walked down the street before. I don't think anyone else knew about anything about them. So yeah, I think I understand at least some of that. It is interesting to me how this is an odd way of putting it, but like the phrase cybernetics, and by that I mean systems of control, and not just like machines, but government, process, bureaucracy, things working. For there to be adventure, you kind of need those to be failing in some way. And in a city, for there to be adventure, you need there to be failures of control, I think, or mistakes, or things that are hidden underneath apparent control. And that brings me to like where you were talking about the two different books, Invincible Overlord and City of the World Emperor. And Invincible Overlord was done in one way, I think, very particular, very detailed, every guy in a certain shop, and all of these are written to be very clearly to be adventured in. And then they tried to replicate the same thing for City State of the World Emperor, but it wasn't the same kind of city at all. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Yes, with one kind of correction for the record. I think there's one thing I feel bad about in this post on the City State of the World Emperor, which is I place all the blame for the failures of it as I see it on this guy, Creighton Hippenhammer, who I corresponded with on Facebook. And, my conclusion was that, it probably, that I put it all in his head, but I think my reading was wrong. And I think it's likely that actually it was Bledsaw who wrote the bad parts of the City State of the World Emperor. So anyway, I have a kind of bad conscience. I need to go back and correct it. The problem is it would take me real textual work. I tried to find out just by asking, but I couldn't. So it will take real textual work to establish this. But anyway, sorry, I had a guilty conscience about maybe having slandered this man. But here's the basic story. City State of the World Emperor City State of the Invincible Overlord is a very particular kind of thing. It's a kind of stupid fantasy city, a kind of goulash that throws together all the sword and sorcery tropes with Tolkien and everything, stew, and it tries to make this kind of run a city as a dungeon. There are encounters, particular kinds of encounters that you're supposed to roll on each named street. Every shop has a leveled shop owner, and many of the shops are themselves like seeds of adventure. They all have these rumors that you can hear in the shop, one or more for each shop. And the whole thing is like this crazy anarchistic, lawless place where you can just walking from point A to point B get embroiled in all of these adventures. And I've been running it for kids, for my son and his cousins. I've run like maybe 5 or 6 sessions there, probably more than that actually. It's probably more like 8 or 9 sessions. And it totally works. The whole adventure is just scheme after scheme, and they get sucked into one. They're doing one thing, and they get sucked into the next thing, and everything of these memorable things, and it really works at what it's trying to do. City State of the World Emperor is just totally different. It's this fascistically controlled city, which is like a viper's nest. It's ruled by these demonic Viridian, kind of god pharaoh types. And, it's all dedicated to the worship of one deity instead of 1,000, whatever, 1,000 deities in City State of the Invincible Overlord. And there are like spies everywhere. And so, it's like playing that city is it's just not going to be this kind of anarchistic goulash of the random rolls, and every shopkeeper is like somehow a wizard or an ogre or whatever who has some lead on some crazy scheme he wants you to get into. It's not that at all. Okay, fair enough. But here's the thing: it's written using the same formula. So it goes through the kind of detail of all the shopkeepers and tells you about each one, even though there's no adventure to be had in any of them. Because they're just people who are selling things in some horribly repressive regime where there's like nothing. So, it's like the ultimate failure of the form is not suited at all to the function. This template was built for City State of the Invincible Overlord, and then it was brought into City State of the World Emperor. And I think the City State of the World Emperor could be an amazing city where you could have tons of adventures, but the adventures will just be, they're going to be very different. And so you need a different kind of engine. And so it's a nice example for me about how kind of cities could be different kind of arenas of play depending on your kind of idea of the city, and then they would need different forms in the product. What works in City State of the Invincible Overlord is just not going to work in City State of the World Emperor.
Yeah, that's an idea I really liked and one that fascinated me. I think you said the way we design our D&D city should depend on the city. So it's almost as if there can't be a city format for old school D&D, because of the informational quality of it, because they each have different power structures, because they just feel different, and you would play different. Every single city would almost have to be a boutique creation of some weirdo, which not only has different stuff in it, but is even organized differently, right down to this way things are arranged on the page and the kind of information that flows back and forth between you and the supplement. I wasn't intelligent enough to write a question about that, which I should have done.
I mean, I do, you know, and by the way, reviewing these cities in a way, my interest in them is against the backdrop of Vornheim. So Vornheim is kind of the other of the city-state of the invincible overlord. I mean, it's, you know, it's the opposite, you know, city-state of the invincible overlord tells you about each shop, each street. But I mean, I think, you know, Vornheim, which is, I think, a brilliant product. Some people were like, I wrote the post about the city-state of the invincible overlord, and they're like, yeah, I hate Vornheim. I said, no, wait a minute. No. That's not my point. My point was there's more than one way to skin a cat, and it depends. Sorry, it's a horrible. I always use that expression, and I always say.
I don't like cats anyway.
Yeah, right. So anyway, my point is, you know, actually Vornheim, which presents itself as a kind of kit, as though it could be used for any city. This seems laughable to me. I mean, because I think it works totally, as far as I can tell, works. But it works for this kind of vision of a city as this kind of endlessly recursive, kind of punk, you know, kind of iterating, you know, thing. And it gives you a bunch of toolkits for that. But it's, I think, again, very particular to a kind of vision of what the place is. And I'm not saying you couldn't hack all kinds of subsystems from it to do other things, but I do think, you know, yeah, when I look at each of these things, it seems like they're designed to facilitate play in a different city. And I'm trying to work my way through other like old city supplements to kind of see if this is true. So I'm like looking at the Thieves World stuff kind of now, you know, but I don't really have thoughts about that yet. But yeah, there'll be more posts about this eventually.
That's good. It is interesting, and I would like it to be true. I think I never asked, but I do think Zach was aware of Invincible Overlord, and I think he did Vornheim. I think there's a kind of informational opposite to it, although I can't confirm that. And I have hacked that book a lot and used it a lot. I will ask the question that Ian wanted to know as a brief break. He says, you've been a prolific creator through your blog and your game. Do you ever make use of others' material? And if so, what generally draws you to it?
Yeah, so this has really changed for me. So my whole idea of running my game online was to never use anyone else's material. Not only with one exception, not only have I not used anyone else's material, I've never used a monster from anywhere else. I mean, there were kind of zombies in one dungeon that I did, but you know, that's the closest it's ever.
That's impressive. That's major hipster points.
It's ever come. So that was like the idea. And you know, when I bought a lot of products from the community during that time, and you know, my approach to them at the time was the following. They were for me. I was curious about what other people were doing. I was very interested to see it. They were sources of inspiration. It's how I got into this. It's how I got the idea of doing these crazy things, was by seeing other people do them. And it, you know, it gave me a lot of things that could be, and it served a kind of food for the imagination. But then I started running games for kids because my son became old enough to play D&D. And boy, did he take to it, man. And so was the thing. I didn't have any time to prepare for them, and it would all be, in a way, the kind of thing mojo that I rock is going to be totally lost on kids. I think it's
right. Yeah, it's not gonna. You can't do weird like punk Harrisonian like edgelord fantasy with like your kid.
Yeah, it's not gonna work. So I just started like pulling all the things off my shelf and running them, and so I've run a ton of other people's stuff. I ran, you know, the first thing I did was Tomb of the Iron God, which was perfect for him. I mean, I can't tell you how he lit up at it and how it introduced it succeeded. It did what it was supposed to do, introduce all the basic ideas, and he got it. And then I did Slumbering Ursine Dunes with him. I, you know, probably played 12 sessions in Tomb of the Iron God and probably 20 sessions. And, you know, Slumbering Ursine Dunes is perfect for kids. It's got this kind of, it's very open, but it's got this kind of cosmic alignment-based factions that are at war with each other, and it's goofy, and it's not too serious, and it has like cartoon villains, and you know, it's got like a benevolent but detached God with kind of vague homoerotic tendencies. But never mind, you know, never mind that for the kids. But the point is, you know, it also like it introduced, like, kids are big into faction play. They love it. They
really
right away. I mean, the idea that they'll go with these ones and that they'll upset the schemes of those ones, and maybe they'll switch. Kids love that stuff. And so, yeah, so I started playing all these things, and I've done Hot Springs Island, I've done Barrow Maze, I do a lot of DMing for kids, so I've done a lot of stuff. In my own game, I ran only one thing. It was at a time recently when I was experiencing fatigue. I kind of have gotten over it now, but I was experiencing fatigue, and I had this like awesome thing in my mind in the setting, which was there was this magical tome, Evocations of the Doomed City, and it was you basically say the different like rituals in it call into being the different neighborhoods in this doomed city, each of which is like a dungeon where you can learn something from, you know, like some kind of like sage or instructor. And so, you know, like the rooftop maze, and, you know, you'll learn like the sword techniques, and, you know, some you know, I had this idea, and then I just couldn't do it. I was like, there's no way, on top of everything else, that I'm going to just take this magic book, you know. And so I had read this thing by one of my players, the wonderful module I want to review soon, which people I think don't really know about. Anthony Husso's module called A Fabled City of Brass.
That's the second mention for Anthony Husso on this, whatever this thing I'm doing is. He's very popular.
Yeah, well, good. He should be. It's you know, and it reimagines, you know, using kind of like, you know, Arabian Nights type stuff, and the back of the picture on the back of the Dungeon Master's Guide. It reimagines the city of Brass as this kind of doomed city. It's totally fantastical, and it's built for high level play. It's incredibly evocative. His stuff has the defect that he hasn't absorbed the principles of information presentation and utility that the OSR has created. And so they're not user-friendly, but they're incredibly beautiful. This one, anyway, is incredibly beautiful and very evocative. And it was incredible fun to play, also as an experiment for me, because I ran it. It's a very high-level AD&D module. And I ran it that way. I had the Evocations of the Doomed City basically projected you into these heroic personas. You could occupy, you know, I gave them a menu of these like legendary figures. And the players got to occupy. And so we played these sessions of super high level AD&D in this Anthony Husso module. And that's the one deviation from this otherwise relentless thing I've had of just using my own content.
Did it work well at high levels? Because Bryce is convinced that that the high level module is an impossibility. It's like, you know, El Dorado. I'm probably overstating what he said.
One thing, I think it worked. I think it was a little bit much for me. And I always drink when I'm running my online game. And so it was hard for me because there are so many things to keep track of when they're powerful enemies. And we were running it as AD&D almost by the book. But nonetheless, I do think it, I mean, I think it worked. You know, basically, here's my experience of high-level AD&D. The characters are immensely powerful but incredibly fragile. So they all could die. Like, you know, like a 15th level magic user, you know, is like incredibly vulnerable to insta-death. And if you're fighting people who, you know, if you're fighting, you know, a 20 hit die fire elemental or demons who can have all these at-will effects and can teleport and, you know, all this stuff, it's actually like an incredibly fragile thing. The thing is that the characters, by having access to the spells they have, are able to also just wreak this incredible reality-changing devastation on everything that's around them. So it's kind of this weird thing where you're very vulnerable, but also immensely powerful. And so it is hard to wrap your head around what it would be to like really run a campaign at that level. And I can't pretend to know like how you would do that successfully.
Thank you. We don't hear many play reports from very high level stuff, so it's interesting to hear. So let me see. There's another question from Kayani. Did you change your game system? Oh, sorry. Did you change game systems for your game as time progressed? Did you start with one switch to another? I'm assuming you're altering rules on the fly like everyone in the OSR does. Did you ever do like a major shift?
Not really. I mean, there are things, of course, that I changed. When I read Gus L's Apollyon rules, I was very impressed by them. Kind of by talking to Anthony Huso, I was also got like into some of the arcane AD&D stuff that OSR types, at least in an earlier phase, tended to really have an allergic reaction to, but that are kind of neat to like think about, like segments and
weapon speeds.
Yeah, I think the problem is that people say like it's unplayable, but actually I think it's the opposite. I think that like you actually kind of have to use all the rules. This AD&D thing, like it kind of all fits together in this way. And so actually, I think, I don't understand it well enough to know like what you could and couldn't pull out. But so I mess around with this stuff. But the truth is that I'm not a rules guy. It doesn't really move me. I mean, I'm perpetually dissatisfied at the way I run combats. I always feel like I screw it up. I always feel like it's not tense enough. I always feel like if I just don't feel like I have my wits about me. I feel like on everything else, I run a pretty tight ship, but in combat. And so I always have this fantasy, oh, maybe the rules will save me. But the thing is that rules aren't really where my heart is, actually. So, not really.
I think you should definitely speak on it, even if you don't know what you're talking about. It never stops anyone else. And I think that the OSR is waiting for a kind of like a contrarian hot take. Wake up, nerds! Weapon speeds are amazing. You were wrong for years, all of you. I'd read that. Most of your content, almost all of your monsters, all of your creatures come with images, and you seem to be like well supplied and really interested in them. Do you have any recommendations or anything you'd like to point out from DeviantArt or any other image site? In particular artists?
Maybe later I could throw up a link, but Tumblr is an incredible source. I've been out of it for a while, so I'm not sure what's still going and what's not, but kind of Tumblr was an incredible source for me. And I used to I have something like 1,200 liked images on Tumblr, which becomes a problem because Tumblr actually doesn't have a good way to search those or kind of look at them. But this did create this incredible like storehouse for me. I feel bad. Let me provide links later, but I can say something about how images work for me in this, which is that my imagination like has a lot of I don't have a great like if you just say go, I can't do it. My imagination like grinds down very quickly, and so often I'll have like kind of the general image for a place. Like it's like currently my players in the dungeon. It's like space-time nightmare, a la Philippe Drouillet or whatever. That'll be like the total concept I have of it. Okay. So they're in the sanctum of the temporal maenads, or like the mad, enlightened sages who are like, monsters, basically. And, okay, how the hell am I going to make a dungeon with this, right? So, then, okay, but now just like I hit Tumblr, I do Google image searches, French comics are always a source. I mean, certainly like Moebius, Drouillet, other figures in that. field are hugely influential for me, I think, in shaping like my imagination, Moebius, others. You know, there's obviously a lot of great concept art now too. You know, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure. But I do often, when I grind down, what I do is I just start trolling for images. And, you know, I just kind of find my way in here or there. And then, like, basically write descriptions around images that I find. And that is kind of how I do it.
I think my first knowledge of Dirk Cheese images came from a blog post of yours. I think the puppets one, which he's actually working on a book with me right now, so that was handy. Did you ever go any further on stuff? I think you had a post like rhythms are playing on G+, which is just something I'm very familiar with, like the 3-hour game and information like how many rooms you can get through in a dungeon. Did you ever go into have any more thoughts on how G+ gaming or internet gaming would affect dungeon or adventure design?
Yeah, a little bit.
Because I have very shallow dungeons in my internet games. I have people can walk around a lot outside. They're quite happy doing that. And I tend to have like point crawls or line crawls. But for dungeons, they're not big because whenever I'm playing in a game online, if there's a dungeon, if I'm in there at the end of the game, mapping, remembering where you are, it just becomes like a labyrinth, but not in a fun way for me anyway.
Yeah,
So
okay, I do have some things to say about that. I mean, so my players have explored huge dungeon environments. So like there's this hanging palace in the inverted jungle in the Dreamlands, which, you know, probably in total would have something like 300 rooms if it were all mapped, and they've explored like maybe, you know, 80 of those. And there's another tentpole dungeon, the Abyssal Dungeon, which has all these locks. And each level is like kind of its own thing. And they've explored one full level of that over many, you know, I don't know, 12 sessions or something. So I do have experience, and so I do have some things to say about this. One thing to say is I think you have to embrace the episodic quality. And my view is, why push against it? Roll with the episodic kind of uncommitted character of a lot of Hangouts playing. Here's how I roll with it. It's convenient for me because I have this Dreamlands thing, but you know, my rule, I have this rule, which is that when your character's there, your character's there, and when you go away, your character goes away. And the idea is it's supposed to be like dreams. So
yeah, I do the same thing.
Yeah, so it's like, you know, there's a kind of dream logic to it. Like, you know, all of a sudden somebody's with you in a dream that seems all natural, then they're gone and it's somebody else. And so, you know, I kind of play that way, and I tend to like let people into the game. So that's part of it. Another part of it is that I do all the mapping for my players. I do the maps, I scan the maps, and then I do a kind of fog of war revealing of them for my players when it's necessary. And then I put the current map image up on the community. And then when they just, you know, with annotations, and then when they discover more, I do it again. And so this allows everyone to maintain a sense of where they are, where they want to go next. But I will say that one huge takeaway of Hangouts playing for me about dungeon design is that people are very impatient because they feel like they have no time. And so I think this thing that was like a big thing in early D&D, it's deadly for Hangouts. You gotta not do this. Which is this thing where, you know, it's like the Red Nails, kind of like endless halls, and things are only 10% of rooms are occupied. You'll see people on like Knights and Knaves Ale House and all these like Gygaxian, you know, maniacs being like, you know, there can't be more than is something interesting in like 1 out of every 6 rooms. You know, I mean, forget it. Every part of the dungeon has to be interesting. So that does lend itself to, you know, it's better a kind of jewel box thing than a kind of not very well kind of thought out big sprawling thing. But I think, you know, knowing that your players aren't going to be able to get through that much in a session means that you can build out a jewel box thing into a pretty big dungeon. okay, I don't have to do that much. If there's just one way in and then they can go a bunch of ways, I really only need to kind of get out to here. So I got a jewel box.
Right.
And then now I kind of know where they're going to go next. So now and you kind of build it as they come. That's kind of my strategy. Yeah.
That's cool. Did your kid ever do any more writing for D&D? Because he did those magical items. I liked Big Lock. Did he do any more after that?
Yeah, sure, of course, all the time. Two things. One is this incredible, it's kind of come to a stop, but I have to revive it. There's this incredible monster manual that he is working on, mailing it back and forth with my dad, his grandfather, who's an artist. And so they would each do like a couple of entries in an alphabetical monster manual. And, my father's, he doesn't quite get D&D. And they're totally weird things, the things he's coming up with. And then my son is like writing stats for them and then doing his own entries. And they were mailing it back and forth. And this will be, if only it can start up again and actually get some more entries to it, will be an incredible document, which I certainly will share with people when it's created. It's really going to be something bizarre. I think people's mind will be blown by it in some kind of twisted way. But then he does less interesting things. I mean, right now, he's working with me and other kids on 6th edition, which is just, the same heartbreaker, rehashing of all the, let's have an alchemist class and there should be, barbarians, because he's only ever played like 1st edition AD&D, so he doesn't know that they're like that barbarian is like a basic class, or like they're, so there's a lot of real.
How much cognitive energy are you putting into not crushing his dreams every time he has an idea?
I put a lot into not crushing the dreams. I mean, that is, I mean, I basically try to, I'm able to share with him a lot of stuff from my adult D&D stuff, but just little glimpses here and there. Like I introduced him to the Hex Kit app recently, and that blew his mind, or I'll show him this or I'll show him that. But I think basically I just have to let him kind of do thing and facilitate it without like I have to foster the flame. I mean, with all kids' interests, it's like, I mean, kids, they do everything much worse than we do. They have a certain lack of inhibition, which serves them well, and a wonder at it, discovering things. But the thing is, we're just bigger and better versions of them. The D&D we play is better. And that's, but thank God, thank God. So a lot of it is about like just, keeping the wonder alive and fostering that kind of flame. So I try not to crush any dreams.
Okay. I think you mentioned on your most recent post, you're maybe bringing publishing, releasing, thinking about how to bring your special setting out and maybe share it with everybody. Have you gone any further with that or had any further ideas? Because I know, like, basically when I asked people who I should interview next, a bunch of people came up. You were mentioned multiple times. I know your blog isn't very huge, but the people who read it really like it.
That's wonderful to hear. I can't tell, like, it doesn't seem like anybody reads blogs, and so I can't tell what's going on. I mean, I know a certain amount of people from playing face to face, so it's very hard for me to gauge, like, what little minimal. I mean, these are tiny little markets anyway. But what there might be interest in. What to say about this? I think I can say what my kind of inclination is. My inclination is it's too big. It's a thing to really be published as one product. I think, I could imagine it being published as one product, but it would require, I think, like an incredible investment from somebody not me. in order to realize it in an adequate form.
Right, I think that's nice because with my own experience, very, very big books can come down you like a ton of bricks over multiple years. It's better to
Yeah,
publish something rather than have nothing or something in like in the distant future.
right. So like I have talked to some publishers and of these small little indie OSR type publishers, and I think people would publish, modules for me. They might publish a setting book. They'll publish various things. I haven't talked to. There's the kind of the elephant in the room. I haven't talked to Raji. Is that how you say his name?
I think so.
Yeah,
I think,
I
yeah,
haven't.
sure.
I haven't talked to him. He obviously has the greatest capacity and kind of vision for these things. But anyway, yeah. So my current thinking is probably I will explore all my options. I will talk to various people. I'll pitch. I'll probably even pitch Raji just to see what he thinks would be possible, if anything. But my gut tells me that the really fun thing for me to do would be to release it in bite-sized bits as a kind of fanzine that follows out the kind of course in which I kind of produce the thing for my game. So it's a kind of entree to the Dreamlands, which I have, which is a single door, which opens to a single place, in the undercity of this flying city in the Dreamlands, and then it kind of opens up from there along various avenues, and then there's kind of this dream jungle beneath and the city above, and so I thought I could do bite-sized bits on a kind of zine. I could probably I could probably make the first issue nice, and then maybe I could cover the costs for it by selling zines to the tiny number of people who would buy such things. And then, so I thought maybe I could do it that way. There's a part of me that really wants to produce things for free.
Yeah,
because,
yeah.
Because that was a bigger thing with OSR before. And my own view is that it's not a bad thing that the OSR grew and that all these publishers got going, and that I think we're seeing more ambitious products that reach a wider audience with higher production values that are really neat and that give some people work and money. And I think all those things are really good. And my own view isn't terrible about that, but it was lovely, all this kind of mad sharing of things in this kind of communal, brotherly spirit that I think was more going on before. And so there's like a romantic part of me, or like a political part of me or something, that like makes me want to just like, kind of share it for free. And it feels kind of inhibited by the fact that, I'm inhibited by two things. One, that I do want to present the material to people. And so I have been like thinking, well, I don't just want to put everything up on my blog, like everything. And then another thing, of course, is I'm running the game. That's actually the main obstacle. So I can't tip my hand.
Right.
And since it's an open world, like essentially everything's live at every point. So it makes it's very inhibiting. But anyway, yeah. So I think probably a zine is like what I'm thinking now. And then with the possibility that maybe things might be gathered together and represented in some more fancy form later.
I think that's very possible. People will read thrice and pay twice, I think. They'll read it on the blog if it's free, and then they will probably do a Patreon for a zine, I think. And then if the zine is like zine quality, and then in the future, say 5 years down the line, as well, and someone wants to do like the big fuck off, I want in any book, then they'll probably pay for that as well. People like high quality, and they don't really object as long as you're honest about what things are, I think. Okay, so I think that's roughly an hour. I've run out of interesting questions. Is there anything that that you wanted to be asked, or that you wanted to talk about that I haven't brought up, or anything you want to clarify?
No, it's been wonderful talking to you.
Yeah,
nice face to face.
Yes, thank you, by the way, for doing this. It's been really enjoyable. I will now, well, bye from me, and I will shut down the live stream.